A woman kneels beside a pit dug into the floor of her hut, carefully stacking dried grain, seeds, and strips of preserved meat into the earth. She isn't hungry right now. There's no famine outside her door today, and yet she keeps working, burying more food than she and her family could eat in weeks, sealing it away where no one else can find it. Here's the strange part. Anthropologists studying sites like this have found that this behavior wasn't rare or unusual. It was universal. Nearly every early human settlement ever excavated shows some form of deliberate, excessive storage, far beyond what immediate survival required. That's not an isolated habit. That's a hardwired instruction, buried in every one of us, running quietly under the surface of your life right now. Because here's the question that should actually bother you. If hoarding served ancient survival, why does the exact same instinct show up in someone today, with a closet they can't close, a garage they can't park in, drawers stuffed with things they haven't touched in a decade? This isn't really a question about clutter. It's a question about whether a survival instinct built for scarcity ever knows how to switch off once scarcity disappears, and what happens to us in the meantime. It's also, quietly, a billion-dollar question. The self-storage industry alone generates tens of billions of dollars annually in the United States. An entire economy built on people paying monthly fees to keep items they don't have room for, and, in many cases, never retrieve. That's not a niche curiosity. That's a measurable, modern industry, built directly on top of an instinct that predates agriculture. To understand what's really going on, we have to go back to the actual conditions this instinct was built for. For most of human history, food didn't arrive on a predictable schedule. A successful hunt might feed a group for days. A failed one could mean going without for a week or more. Archaeologists studying early storage pits, like those found across Upper Paleolithic Europe, note that these structures appear specifically in regions with harsh seasonal swings, places where a good autumn had to carry a family through a brutal, foodless winter. Here's the pivot, and it matters. That unpredictability didn't just shape what humans ate. It shaped how their brains learned to respond to abundance itself. Excavations at sites like Dolní Věstonice, in what's now the Czech Republic, reveal storage pits dug directly into permafrost, natural refrigeration used to preserve mammoth and reindeer meat across entire seasons. These weren't casual leftovers. They represent deliberate, labor-intensive planning. Months of anticipated need calculated in advance, by people who had no written calendar to track any of it. Researchers studying reward psychology point to a specific mechanism. When resources are unpredictable, acquiring and keeping surplus triggers a stronger dopamine response than steady, reliable access ever does. In other words, our brains are wired to feel a small hit of reward, specifically from accumulating more than we currently need. Precisely because our ancestors, who felt that pull, survived winters that wiped out those who didn't. That's not weakness. That's evolution's insurance policy, still quietly running inside you. But that's only one explanation, and on its own, it doesn't fully hold up, because hoarding didn't only apply to food. Archaeological sites from the Bronze Age onward show elaborate hoards of non-perishable goods, bronze tools, ornamental beads, sometimes objects with no practical use at all, buried and never recovered. Food scarcity alone can't explain why someone would bury a decorative object they were never going to eat. Some of these hoards, like those found across Bronze Age Britain, contain dozens of intact, high-value bronze axes buried together in a single pit. Items valuable enough that archaeologists initially assumed they must have been hidden for later retrieval during a crisis. But many were never reclaimed, even generations later, suggesting some hoards weren't practical stockpiles at all, but deliberate, ritualized displays of wealth removed permanently from circulation. This is where a second explanation enters the picture: status. Anthropologists studying resource accumulation across cultures have found that visible surplus, herds, grain stores, ornamental wealth, consistently correlated with social standing. Having more wasn't just about surviving the next winter. It was proof to the rest of the group that you were someone who could survive any winter, a walking guarantee of stability that made you more valuable as an ally, a trading partner, or a mate. Think about what that means. The instinct to keep more than you need might be doing two jobs at once, ensuring against future scarcity and broadcasting present strength, layered on top of each other so completely that early humans likely couldn't separate the two. Here's where it gets more complicated, though, and worth pausing on, because neither explanation fully accounts for what we now see in modern hoarding behavior. Clinical researchers studying hoarding disorder today have found that the objects people struggle to part with are frequently not valuable, useful, or scarce in any sense. Old newspapers, broken appliances, duplicate items with zero resale or practical value. If ancient scarcity wiring or status signaling fully explained the behavior, this pattern wouldn't make sense, since none of these items solve either problem. Brain imaging studies on individuals with hoarding disorder have found unusual activity in regions associated with decision-making and perceived loss, specifically when asked to discard their own possessions, activity that doesn't appear when discarding identical items belonging to someone else. The distress isn't about the object's usefulness. It's about the act of separation itself. Researchers now argue that in modern hoarding disorder specifically, the ancient instinct appears to misfire, attaching itself to emotional security rather than actual resource security, especially in people who've experienced real loss, instability, or trauma. The object stops representing future survival and starts representing an attempt to control an unpredictable world through possession itself. That's an important distinction. Normal accumulation and clinical hoarding aren't the same behavior at different volumes. They may be the same ancient circuitry, wired to two very different targets. So where does that leave the rest of us, the ordinary closet avoider, the person with a garage they can't park in? The honest answer is more boring and more interesting than either extreme. Most modern accumulation isn't a malfunction. It's an ancient, once adaptive instinct operating inside an environment that no longer resembles the one it evolved for. You are not broken for holding on to things you don't need. You are running software built for seasonal famine, in a world of year-round grocery stores and next-day delivery, and nobody updated the code. Consider how quickly that environment actually changed. For roughly 300,000 years, unpredictable scarcity was the baseline condition of being human. Reliable, on-demand abundance, the kind most of us take for granted today, has existed for less than a century in most of the world. Evolution doesn't move on that timeline. The instinct had no chance to catch up. So here's the full picture. It starts as a woman burying grain against a winter she can't predict. A strategy that quite literally kept her genetic line alive. It becomes a reward system, wiring a small hit of satisfaction into the simple act of having more than you need. It becomes a status symbol, turning visible surplus into proof of strength long before anyone kept written records. And in a small number of people, shaped by loss or instability, that same ancient wiring turns inward, attaching itself not to food or status, but to control itself. None of these explanations alone fully accounts for a stuffed drawer you haven't opened in years. Together, they very possibly do. Here's what makes this worth sitting with. The instinct that once kept your ancestors alive through winters that killed the unprepared is the exact same instinct quietly filling your closet today. It isn't a flaw in you, it's a message from every ancestor who almost didn't make it, still being delivered, long after the danger it was warning you about has already passed. Maybe the goal was never to silence that instinct completely. Maybe it's just learning to recognize the voice for what it actually is, and deciding, consciously, when it's still worth listening to.